Hello and welcome to Chapter 12 of our Python 3 Basics video series. In this video we're going to now be discussing this concept of global and local variables. So when people start to use functions, they can quickly get confused when it comes to global and local variables. So you might get the dreaded variable is not defined even when you can clearly see that it is defined. Now the terms global and local correspond to a variable's reach within a script or a program. A global variable is one that can be pretty much accessed anywhere, globally, right? A local variable is basically the opposite. It can only be accessed within its locale. The difference is that global variables can be accessed locally, but they can't be modified locally inherently. A local variable cannot be accessed globally inherently, but it can be obviously modified locally. Now, don't worry about committing that all to memory right now. I think it will make a lot more sense when we see it and do it. So let's go ahead and get started. So we can begin by saying something like x equals 6. Then we can define a function using def example, for now empty parameters, colon, and then we're going to say z equals 5. Now, x here is a global variable. Z is going to be local, but x is actually better thought to be local than global, but it's local to everything under it. So it's even local to this function, but you can't edit it necessarily with this function, but I'll show you guys that shortly. So define example, z equals 5, and you should be able to see that we can print z. So we'll save and run this. Now if you didn't call the function, like we didn't actually call the function, so now would be a good time to also bring up the fact that sometimes people might make a script and then run it and nothing happens, even though they've got a script here. This is because we've defined the function, but we haven't actually called the function to run. So either you would type example empty params down here, or you could also just come here and do example empty parameters and run that. So it prints 5. Now, this is where we can get into trouble. We could, after the function, print z, save and run that, but we get z is not defined. Well, the reason for this is z is local. It's local to example. So we can't actually print it out. We can't access it at all. Now, that one is a little easy for people to swallow, but here's the one that gets very confusing to people. First, let me comment this out. Cannot do this. How about define example 2, z equals 7, print z, but then we also want to print x, because we defined x up here, right? So we're going to be able to do this, so we can save and run this, and we'll run example 2, example 2, and we get 7 for z and 6 for x, because we defined x. But what if we want to do something like print x plus equals 1? Something like that. We'll save and run that. Let's see. Print. We'll do x plus equals 1, and we will do print x. So here again, x plus equals 1 is the same as x equals x plus 1. So we'll do x plus equals 1, then we'll print x. Now, we'll run example 2, and let me pull this up slightly. Run it, and we get local variable x referenced before assignment. Now, this is what really gets people, because we can see that originally, even though now it's not printing x at all, when we do this and run it, example 2, we get 7 and we get 6. But as soon as we start trying to modify x, even though we were just able to a second ago print out x, and in theory in our heads reference x, we can't do it anymore because we have this problem of global and local variables. Now, what can we do about this? Well, the first thing that you might think about is you might say, well, what if we did, let's say y equals x plus 1. Something like that. And let's get rid of that print x. and then let's say print y. Because we knew we were able to reference x at least, right? So we save and run that. We'll do example 2. Whoops. We did get an error. For some reason when I typed that, there we go. Okay, so we have 7 and 7, okay? Now, you can see here that we were able to do that because we assigned it to a new variable. So, in this sense, we do have this global variable, but then we come down here and we're able to get the value of x, but as you recall just a moment ago, we weren't able to actually modify x. But here what we did was we made a new variable, and we just said that new variable is equal to x plus 1. Now, what else could we do? So this is really what's considered to be best practice. If you have teachers, or maybe your boss, maybe a CTO of the company is very anal retentive about things, this is the best practice. A lot of people think that there's no good reason to ever global a variable, but sometimes this can get kind of confusing, especially if you have a variable that you want to retain its value through the entire operation, and anytime you manipulate that variable, you want that change to occur globally. But just for the record, a lot of people don't like that. Now, what you could do is you could, say you want to eventually get this back to the x variable, you would just, at the end of the function, return y, and then you would say x equals example 2. And then you print x, save and run that, and you can see 777. Very lucky program, 777. Now, that would be, again, considered best practice. But what if you still don't want to do best practice and you still want to do global variables as you maybe intended originally? Well, we can also do that, and we'll say define example 3, empty parameters. And now what we're going to do is up here you see we have x, okay? And we've actually redefined x here, so I'm going to go ahead and move this function to the top, or right here. Let's move it here. So this is the first one that runs, and we're not touching this x. What we will do now is we want to use global x. Now we can even do x plus equals 1, print x, save, and then we'll run example 3, and we get 8. Now print x, still 8. So now we're able to reference x, we can modify x, and we can obviously continue on using x throughout the entire script, because this is local to the entire script, but not global, so keep that in mind. But we did make it global here to this function, and we're allowing this function to modify x as we weren't able to do in the past. Again, I will just say a lot of people consider it not to be best practice to do this. Most people will agree that this is the this is the preferred method. So you don't want to global variables because it can cause trouble, especially in very complex script. Even though it makes programming the complex script easier, sometimes it can cause actually more problems down the road. So again, it comes down to kind of programmer's preference. Also, it comes down to whoever is your boss, whether that's you or someone else. So that concludes chapter 12 on global and local variables. In the next video, in line with is not defined, we're going to be discussing debugging. So chapter 13 will be dedicated to debugging just some of the more basic problems that you're probably going to see from time to time. Most of the time, I'll just give you a heads up, it's a typo, but you might have, indentation issues, you might have reference issues, you might define a variable or a function. I guess you might define either of those after you've actually called it, and so on. So anyway, that's what the next video is going to cover. Stay tuned for that. Thanks for watching.